There is a letter in the archive of the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. It was written in pencil on the back of a torn grocery bag because paper was rationed. The handwriting is careful, almost architectural, the kind of penmanship that suggests someone who learned to write with great deliberateness, as if each letter were a small act of dignity. The date at the top reads, the 14th of March, 1943. The place is listed not as a city, not as a neighborhood, not as any address that a postman could have found on an ordinary map. It reads only, Block 12, Barrack 4, Topaz, Utah. The letter begins, My dearest, I have been rehearsing this sentence for 11 days, and I still do not know how to say it properly, so I will say it plainly, I love you. N. I love you in this place where love seems almost impossible. I love you under this sky, which is the same sky as the one we used to walk beneath in San Francisco, though nothing else is the same. The letter was never sent. It was folded in quarters and placed inside the lining of a coat. The coat was never retrieved. The letter stayed in the coat, and the coat stayed in a barrack, and the barrack was eventually demolished. The letter was found decades later by a historian named Roger Daniels, who was sifting through materials donated to the archive by a family who had survived what the United States government officially called, with a bureaucratic gentleness that itself constitutes an accusation, the War Relocation Authority Centers. We do not know who wrote this letter, we do not know who they loved, we do not know whether the love survived. This is, I want to suggest to you, not a detail. This anonymity is the point. This is what erasure looks like when it is total, not the dramatic burning of books, not the loud silencing of voices, but the quiet disappearance of the interior lives of 120,000 human beings who were stripped of their homes, their livelihoods, their constitutional rights, and in a way that has been almost entirely absent from the historical record, their most private emotional worlds. We know the broad outline of the Japanese-American internment. It appears, briefly, in high school history textbooks. It is referenced in footnotes. It earned an official apology from Congress in 1988, 46 years late, and reparations of $20,000 per surviving detainee, a sum so inadequate that its inadequacy is itself a kind of continuing statement. But what has almost never been taught, what has been systematically absent from the cultural memory of this event, is the emotional life that existed inside those camps, the romances that formed, the marriages that were conducted in laundry rooms and mess halls, the love letters that were censored by government officials who read every piece of outgoing and incoming mail, the courtships that happened under armed guard, beneath watchtowers, against the backdrop of barbed wire. This is that story. It is a story about love as an act of resistance. It is a story about what it means to be fully human in conditions designed consciously or unconsciously to reduce you to a category, a number, a security risk. And it is a story about why those who administer power have always found the inner lives of the oppressed inconvenient, embarrassing, and ultimately threatening. Because love, as it turns out, is incompatible with dehumanization. And if you are trying to dehumanize a people even bureaucratically, even with the best of stated intentions, the last thing you want documented is that they were, in the fullest and most irreducible sense, in love. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what was built and what was destroyed before the building. The Japanese-American community that existed on the west coast of the United States in the winter of 1941 was not, as it is sometimes lazily described, a single monolithic community. It was layered, generationally complex, economically diverse, and deeply rooted. The Issei, the first generation, those who had immigrated from Japan, had arrived primarily between 1000 1880 and 1924, when the Immigration Act of that year effectively closed the door on further Japanese immigration. They had built farms in the Central Valley of California, fishing communities in Terminal Island near Los Angeles, flower nurseries in the hills above San Jose. They had done what immigrants do everywhere, which is to say they had planted themselves so thoroughly in a place that the place began, slowly, to reflect them. Their children, the Nisei, second generation, American-born citizens had grown up negotiating the impossible dual identity that has always been the particular burden of the American-born child of immigrants. They went to American schools. They played baseball. They read American novels and listened to American jazz. Many of them, particularly those in urban communities in Seattle, Los Angeles, and San Francisco's Japantown, were thoroughly, fluently, ambitiously American. They joined civic clubs. They ran for student government. A disproportionate number of them were, by 1941, enrolled in or recently graduated from American universities. And yet they were not, in the eyes of the law and in the practice of daily social life, fully American. The California Alien Land Law of 1913, renewed in 1920, prohibited Issei from owning agricultural land, a provision deliberately crafted to be race-specific while maintaining the appearance of race neutrality. Banks in California routinely refused loans to Japanese American businesses. Neighborhoods in Los Angeles and San Francisco operated under informal and sometimes formal racial covenants that prevented Japanese American families from buying homes in white residential areas. In many small towns throughout California, Oregon, and Washington, Japanese Americans were refused service at barbershops and restaurants, turned away from public swimming pools, and excluded from the social institutions, the country clubs, the fraternal organizations, the professional associations that served as the connective tissue of American middle-class life. This was the world that existed on the 6th of December 1941. On December 7, at 7:55 inches the morning Hawaiian time, the first Japanese bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. Within hours, the FBI, acting on pre-prepared lists compiled over years of domestic surveillance, had arrested approximately 1,500 Japanese American community leaders. Buddhist priests were taken from their temples. Japanese language teachers were taken from their schools. Newspaper editors were taken from their offices. These were the individuals the federal government had identified, in advance and without individual evidence of wrongdoing, as potential threats. Within weeks, the drumbeat for broader action had begun. The newspapers, particularly on the West Coast, were relentless. The Hearst papers, which had been promoting anti-Japanese sentiment since the turn of the century, now had historical justification for their animus. Columnists like Henry McLemore of the Hearst Syndicate wrote, on the 29th of January 1942, words that bear repeating in their explicit ugliness. I am for the immediate removal of every Japanese on the West Coast to a point deep in the interior. I don't mean a nice part of the interior either. Herd 'em up, pack 'em off and give 'em the inside room in the Badlands. This was the public mood, or rather, this was the public mood, as manufactured by a press that had particular economic and ideological interests in the dispossession of a prosperous and competing minority community. The distinction matters. Fear was real. Wartime anxiety was real. But the specific form that fear took, its direction, its intensity, its political articulation, was shaped by decades of deliberate anti-Japanese agitation that predated Pearl Harbor by 50 years. On the 19th of February, 1942, a date that ought to appear in American memory with the same weight that September 11 carries in another context, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order authorized the Secretary of War to designate military areas from which any or all persons might be excluded. It named no specific group. It did not need to. Everyone understood who it meant. The process that followed was, in its logistical dimensions, one of the most ambitious domestic population movements in American history. Over the following months, approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, nearly two-thirds of them American citizens by birth, were required to report to assembly centers, which were primarily converted racetracks and fairgrounds. They were permitted to bring only what they could carry. They were given days, sometimes 48 hours, to dispose of everything else. Homes were sold at catastrophic losses, or simply abandoned. Businesses were shuttered. Bank accounts, in many cases, became inaccessible. Farms were left unharvested. Entire fishing fleets were confiscated. From the assembly centers, the detainees were transferred by train to 10 permanent relocation centers administered by the newly created War Relocation Authority. These were Manzanar and Tule Lake in California, Poston and Gila River in Arizona, Minidoka in Idaho, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Granada in Colorado, Topaz in Utah, Rover, and Jerome in Arkansas. The locations were chosen with a logic that was partly practical and partly punitive. They were remote, far from the coast, far from military installations, far from the dense populations that might provide either a threat in the government's framing or a source of solidarity in a more honest framing. They were, almost without exception, in landscapes of extreme and sometimes brutal climatic conditions. Manzanar sat in the Owens Valley at the base of the Sierra Nevada, where winter temperatures dropped below freezing and summer temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, where the wind came off the desert floor and drove alkali dust through every gap in the tar paper barracks. Topaz in Utah was built on a dry lake bed where, as the writer Yoshiko Uchida, who was interned there, later recalled, the dust was so fine it penetrated through clothing and settled on lips and eyelids. Heart Mountain in Wyoming recorded temperatures of minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter of 1942. The barracks themselves were hastily constructed. The standard unit was a rectangular room, roughly 20 by 25 feet, in which a family of any size, was expected to live. The walls were not insulated. The floors were unfinished wood through which wind passed freely. Furniture was initially non-existent. Detainees fashioned chairs and tables from scrap lumber. Privacy was a concept. The architecture had no mechanism to support communal bathrooms, and showers, without partitions, in many camps, served hundreds of people. And yet, and this is the central tension that will run through everything that follows into this landscape of deprivation, of bureaucratic indignity, of enforced communality and enforced isolation, human beings brought their full humanity. They brought their grief, and their resilience, and their humor, and their creativity. They brought, inevitably and irrepressibly, their capacity for love. The architecture of longing, courtship behind barbed wire. Let us begin with a woman named Yuri Kochiyama. In 1942, Yuri Nakahara, she would later become Yuri Kochiyama, one of the most consequential civil rights activists of the 20th century. A woman who would befriend Malcolm X and hold him in her arms as he lay dying on the floor of the Audubon Ballroom in 1965, was 20 years old and living in San Pedro, California. Her father, Seiichi Nakahara, was arrested by the FBI on the night of the 7th of December 1941, hours after Pearl Harbor, despite having no evidence of any wrongdoing. He died of illness shortly after his release, a death his family attributed to the trauma and medical neglect of detention. Yuri and her family were sent to Jerome in Arkansas. And it was there, in an internment camp in the Arkansas Delta, that Yuri met and fell in love with Bill Kochiyama, a Nisei from New York who had enlisted in the U.S. Army as thousands of Japanese American men did, with a complicated and profound patriotism that deserves its own careful examination, and who visited the camp while on leave. Their courtship was conducted largely through letters. Bill was serving with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the all-Japanese American unit that would become the most decorated regiment in the history of the United States Army. Yuri was living in a tar paper barrack in a detention camp in a state where she had no prior connection and no future prospects. They wrote to each other across an ocean of national contradiction, he wearing the uniform of a country that had imprisoned his family, she inside the prison that his uniform nominally protected. The letters themselves, some of which are preserved in academic collections, constitute an extraordinary document of wartime interiority. They are tender and funny and politically searching. They discuss jazz. They discuss books. They discuss the absurdity of the specific situation in which they find themselves. They constitute, in miniature, a complete portrait of two fully realized human beings conducting a love story under conditions of surreal injustice. Yuri and Bill married in 1946. They moved to Harlem. The rest of Yuri's story, her decades of activism, her friendships with figures across the civil rights movement, is historically documented, though it too is understudied. But what is almost never discussed is where her story began. It began in Jerome, Arkansas. It began in a mess hall and a recreation barrack. It began in letters that passed through a government censor's desk before they reached their recipient. Now, let us turn to a figure far less well known, but whose story illuminates a different dimension of what love meant inside the camps. His name was Miné Okubo. Or rather, and this matters, because the life of Miné Okubo is a reminder that the archive does not always reflect the lived experience. She was known as Miné, and she was an artist. Miné Okubo was born in Riverside, California, in 1912, the daughter of a Buddhist minister. She studied art at the University of California, Berkeley, and won a fellowship that took her to Europe in 1938. She was sketching in Switzerland when the war in Europe began, and she returned to California. She was interned first at Tanforan, a converted racetrack in San Bruno, and then at Topaz, in Utah. What Okubo did at Topaz was what artists do, she documented. She drew with whatever materials she could find. She sketched daily life, the mess hall lines, the latrine buildings, the guard towers, the dust storms. She drew people playing go under the evening sky, and children attending makeshift schools. And she drew with a particular sensitivity the emotional textures of camp life, the loneliness, the enforced communality, the moments of unexpected beauty. In 1946, she published a book called Citizen 13660, the title, referring to her internment identification number, which contained 206 of these sketches, with accompanying narrative text. It is one of the most remarkable primary documents of the internment experience, but for our purposes, what matters is a specific dimension of what she captured. Throughout the book, Okubo documents the formation of social bonds inside the camp, the way community was reconstructed under the most adverse conditions. She shows us couples walking through the dusty pathways between barracks at dusk. She shows us young people gathered at dances, organized in recreation halls. She shows us the specific choreography of courtship in a space where privacy was structurally impossible and every intimate moment necessarily occurred in public or semi-public view. Okubo herself never married. Whether she had romantic relationships inside or outside the camps, she did not say publicly, a silence that is itself historically meaningful, a reminder that not all the love stories that occurred in the camps were heterosexual, conventional, or in any way legible to the categories the historical record tends to recognize and preserve. The history of queer internment camp experience is almost entirely absent from the existing scholarship, and that absence is itself a form of historical erasure that compounded the original erasure of the internment. Perhaps the most systematically documented love stories of the internment period are those involving the specific institution of the issei marriage, the arranged marriage, and how it was both preserved and transformed inside the camps. Among the first generation, the issei marriage had typically been arranged through a complex social system involving family networks, go-betweens, and in the particular phenomenon known as the picture bride arrangement, photographs exchanged across the Pacific, followed by marriages conducted in Japan in absentia and consummated upon the bride's arrival in America. This system, which had been effectively ended by the Immigration Act of 1924 and various associated diplomatic agreements, had produced thousands of Japanese-American marriages in which the couple had first met, or first truly met, in the United States. Inside the camps, this tradition intersected in complicated ways with the very different courtship culture of the American-born Nisei. The Nisei, who had grown up reading American magazines, watching American films, and absorbing American romantic norms, tended toward the ideal of the love match, the companionate marriage based on mutual attraction and individual choice. Their parents often held to older models of family alliance and collective obligation. The camps, paradoxically, created conditions that both disrupted the traditional family structure and forced a renegotiation of it. The communal mess hall, in particular, had an effect on family dynamics that contemporary observers noted with both interest and concern. Because families ate together in large communal settings rather than at a family table, the domestic meal, the central ritual of Japanese family life, was effectively eliminated. Parents lost one of their primary mechanisms of control over their children's social lives. Young people ate with their peer groups, not their families. They could, for the first time, conduct aspects of their social lives with a degree of independence from parental oversight that had not been possible in the family home. This had immediate consequences for courtship. The sociologist Dorothy Swain Thomas, who directed the Japanese-American evacuation and resettlement study from 1942 to 1948, one of the few systematic contemporary efforts to document the internment experience, noted in her research that the marriage rate in the camps was significantly higher than would have been expected in a community of equivalent size and demographic composition in ordinary conditions. People were marrying younger and more rapidly than they had before. The reasons were multiple. There was the psychological pressure of uncertainty when you do not know how long you will be confined, when your future is structurally indeterminate, the impulse toward commitment, toward anchoring yourself to another person, can become urgent in a way it would not be in ordinary life. There was the fact of proximity. In a bounded space of 2 to 10,000 people, the pool of potential partners was limited, but it was also immediately and unavoidably present. You could not avoid the people you were beginning to love. There was nowhere to go. And there was something else, something that Thomas's sociological framework did not fully capture but that emerges clearly from memoirs, oral histories, and letters. There was the sense that love, in these conditions, was a form of insistence. An insistence on being fully human in a situation, designed however unconsciously to reduce you to a security threat, a demographic category, a problem to be administered. One of the most extraordinary love stories of the entire internment period, and one of the least known, is that of Jin Wakatsuki and her later marriage, but more immediately, the story of her parents, Ko and Riku Wakatsuki, and what the camp did to their marriage. Ko Wakatsuki, the father whose story Jin later told in her landmark 1972 memoir, Farewell to Manzanar, co-written with her husband James D. Houston, was a proud and complicated man. He had come to the United States from Japan in 1904 and had built, over decades, a fishing business at Terminal Island near Los Angeles. He was, in his daughter's portrait of him, a man of considerable dignity and a certain imperious quality, the patriarch of a large family, accustomed to authority, to having his word be final. The camp destroyed that authority. The architecture of the camp, communal eating, communal washing, minimal private space, made the performance of patriarchal headship nearly impossible. Ko Wakatsuki had no table at which to preside, he had no workshop, no boat, no business. He was, as he himself appears to have understood with acute and devastating clarity, surplus, unnecessary, a man without a role. He responded to this situation in the way that many men in similar circumstances respond. He drank. He had whiskey fermented from apricots made by other internees. He became, for a period, abusive. His marriage, which had been, in Janet's memoir, a partnership of considerable depth and durability, a genuine companionate relationship, despite the formal inequalities of its structure, came under severe strain. What is remarkable in Jeannie Wakatsuki, Houston's account, is not the damage the camp did to her parents' marriage that is documented and is devastating, but the way the marriage nonetheless survived. The way Riku Wakatsuki, her mother, held the family together with a combination of practical resourcefulness and emotional endurance that Jeannie describes with an awe that never becomes sentimentality. The way, even in the depths of Ko's breakdown, there were moments of connection between her parents, specific, small, documented moments that indicated that the love which had originally bound them was still present, buried under the rubble of displacement and humiliation, but not extinguished. Farewell to Manzanar is taught in some American schools. But when it is taught, the focus tends to fall on the political dimensions of the internment, the unconstitutionality, the racism, the violation of civil liberties. The emotional core of the book, its portrait of a marriage under pressure, of love stressed nearly to breaking, is treated as background, as personal detail, as family drama. The political and the intimate are systematically separated by the frameworks through which we teach history, and, in that separation, something essential is lost. Let us turn now to a different kind of love story, one that the government found particularly threatening, and which therefore received a particular kind of institutional attention. There were, among the 120,000 people interned, a number of marriages and romantic relationships between Japanese Americans and non-Japanese Americans. The specific legal status of these relationships was, in 1942, complicated by the fact that many Western states maintained anti-miscegenation laws that prohibited marriage between white persons and persons of the Mongolian race, a category that, under California law, as it existed, until 1948, included Japanese Americans. What this meant, in practice, was that a Japanese American man or woman who was in a relationship with a white partner faced a particular kind of impossible situation. If they were interned and their partner was not, maintaining the relationship required, navigating a bureaucratic apparatus that was not designed to accommodate the existence of that relationship. Visits to the camps required war, relocation authority approval, mail was censored. The simple logistics of maintaining a relationship across the barrier of barbed wire required an engagement with federal bureaucracy that was, for many couples, insurmountable. There are documented cases preserved in the files of the War Relocation Authority, now held in the National Archives of non-Japanese Americans, who applied for permission to enter the camps, to visit romantic partners or spouses. The tone of the WRA's responses to these applications is revealing. There is a consistent undercurrent of suspicion, as if the fact of the interracial relationship itself were evidence of some form of unreliability. One administrative memo, dated October 1943, referred to a white man who had repeatedly applied for visitation rights to see his Japanese American wife at Topaz as exhibiting unusual attachment, a phrase whose bureaucratic blandness does not conceal its implication. That ordinary human love for one's spouse was, in the context of an interracial marriage under wartime conditions, something that required explanation. Some of these couples found creative solutions. One of the most remarkable is the case of James Wakasa. Though his story ends in tragedy, not romance, it illuminates the desperation of isolation. More directly relevant are cases like that of Elaine Black Yuneda, a white labor organizer and Communist Party activist, who voluntarily entered the Manzanar camp with her Japanese-American husband Carl Yuneda, a labor organizer and military intelligence volunteer. Elaine Yuneda's decision to accompany her husband into internment to voluntarily accept incarceration rather than allow her marriage to be severed by the geography of injustice was, at the time, treated by many in the press as eccentric at best and subversive at worst. The fact that love might lead a white woman into a Japanese-American internment camp was not a story that fit any of the available narrative templates. The most systematically suppressed dimension of camp love stories, however, is one that has received almost no mainstream historical attention: the question of what happened to love when it ended. The camps were places where marriages fell apart as well as formed. The conditions of internment, the loss of economic role, the enforced proximity, the anxiety about the future, the grief of dispossession created enormous stress on existing relationships. Divorce rates in the camps, while difficult to calculate precisely because of how records were kept, appear to have been significantly elevated compared to pre-war Japanese-American community norms. And divorce, in the camps, had a particular quality of exposure that it did not have in ordinary life. There was nowhere to go after a marriage ended. You continued to eat in the same mess hall, use the same latrines, attend the same recreational events. The ex-spouse was structurally inescapable. The emotional architecture of breakup, the withdrawal, the avoidance, the gradual reconstruction of a self that had been organized around another person, was simply not available in a space where everyone lived in enforced proximity. Some of these fractured relationships found their way into the WRA's administrative records in ways that reveal the bureaucratic absurdity of administering human emotion. There are files in the National Archives documenting disputes over barrack allocation following marital breakdown: who would keep the family's assigned room, who would move to different quarters, and the logistical challenges of reassignment in a facility designed with no provision for the housing of separated adults within family units. Love ending, in Manzanar, required the intervention of a federal agency. Why was this forgotten? The politics of the interior life. The question of why the love stories of the internment camps have been systematically absent from the historical record is not a simple one, and it does not have a single answer. Several overlapping forces contributed to this specific form of erasure, and examining them tells us something important not just about Japanese American history but about how history is made and unmade. The first and most obvious force is the straightforward suppression of the internment experience itself. For decades after the war, the internment was not so much forgotten as actively not remembered. The government had no interest in revisiting a policy that had been, however reluctantly, endorsed by the Supreme Court in Korematsu v. United States in 1944, a decision that was not formally repudiated until 2018, when the Supreme Court overruled it, in the context of Trump v. Hawaii, and even then, only obliquely. The Japanese American community itself was, for many years, divided about whether to speak publicly about the internment at all. This division has a name in Japanese. It is captured in the cultural concept of shikata ga nai, an expression that translates roughly as "it cannot be helped," and which encompasses a broader cultural orientation toward acceptance, toward not making demands, toward not placing one's personal grievance above the harmony of the collective. Whether this orientation was a long-standing cultural value or was partly a survival strategy developed in response to the specific conditions of racial hostility in America? And the answer is probably both. Its effect was to encourage silence about the internment, particularly in the decades immediately following it. The Nisei, who returned from the camps in 1944, 1945, and 1946, entered a world that was, in many ways, hostile to any expression of grievance. They were returning to communities that had profited from their dispossession. Their farms had been taken over, their homes occupied, their businesses absorbed by competitors. In many West Coast communities, there was active hostility to their return. Returning Japanese Americans were shot at. Their properties were vandalized, they were refused service. Against this background, the strategy of silence, of getting on with it, of not making yourself conspicuous by claiming your injury, was not merely a cultural reflex but a practical survival choice. And when survivors did speak about their experiences, there was another powerful force shaping what they said and what they did not. Shame, an emotion whose presence in this context is itself a testimony to the effectiveness of the dehumanization, shaped the narratives that survivors told about themselves. Not shame at being interned, that would be irrational, and the survivors were not irrational. But shame at the conditions of the camps, at the humiliation of the communal bathrooms, at the loss of economic status, at the ways in which the camp had exposed and stressed family relationships. The intimate dimensions of camp life, the romance, the marriage difficulty, the loneliness were precisely the dimensions that shame made hardest to discuss publicly. This connects to a second force, the gendered politics of what counts as history. The stories that were first told about the internment, the stories that entered public consciousness through journalism, through political discourse, through early historical writing, were predominantly stories about men. They were stories about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which fought with documented and acknowledged valor in Italy and France, and whose motto, "Go for broke," has become a kind of epitaph for a particular form of Japanese American wartime identity. They were stories about the constitutional violations, the legal challenges, the political resistance. They were stories told in the idioms of public life, military service, civic participation, legal contestation. The love stories, the marriage stories, the stories of emotional life inside the camps, these were categorized, whether explicitly or implicitly, as women's stories. And women's stories, in the historiographical frameworks that dominated mid-20th century American historical writing, were not history, they were background, context, human interest. They were the soft material around the hard edges of political and military narrative. This categorization was wrong in multiple ways. It was wrong because it misunderstood what was at stake in the emotional life of the camps, which was not soft, not marginal, but absolutely central to how communities survived and how individuals maintained their psychological coherence under assault. It was wrong because it reproduced, within the historical record, exactly the hierarchy of significance that the internment itself had imposed on the people who lived through it, a hierarchy that reduced interior life, family life, emotional life to secondary importance. And it was wrong, which is perhaps the most historically consequential error because it misunderstood the political nature of love under conditions of oppression. Love, in Manzanar, in Topaz, in Heart Mountain, and Roa and Jerome, was not simply a private matter, it was a political act. This is not metaphor, this is a structural claim about how power works and how it is resisted. The internment was, at its deepest level, an attempt to manage a population by categorizing it as collectively suspect, collectively dangerous, collectively outside the political community of the nation. To do this, to maintain the administrative and moral fiction that 120,000 people were dangerous by virtue of their ancestry, it was necessary to prevent the full humanity of those people from being legible to the public and to policymakers. It was necessary to see them as a category rather than as individuals. Love is, definitionally, incompatible with this. To love someone is to encounter them as irreducibly particular as this specific person with this specific history, these specific qualities, this specific name. It is the antithesis of categorical thinking. And so, the love that occurred inside the camps, the courtships, and the marriages, and the letters, and the dances, and the heartbreaks, was not merely incidental to the political story of the internment. It was a form of resistance to it. The detainees who fell in love inside the camps were not, of course, thinking of themselves as engaging in political resistance. They were thinking about the person they loved. But the structure of their situation meant that every act of full humanity, every moment of joy, of tenderness, of playful conversation, of genuine encounter was a small act of insistence against a power that had tried to reduce them to their ancestry. This is why the love stories were suppressed. Not through any conscious conspiracy. The suppression does not require a conspiracy to explain, only an understanding of how the interests of power align with the forgetting of human interiority. The government had reasons not to document the interior lives of the internees too carefully. Those interior lives were evidence of the moral catastrophe of the policy. The community had reasons to prioritize the political and constitutional story over the emotional one. The political story was actionable in ways the emotional story was not. The historical profession had reasons to categorize the love stories as women's history, as personal history, as not quite history. Those reasons were rooted in the gendered hierarchies that shaped the discipline for most of the 20th century. The result of all these converging forces is a specific shape of erasure. Not silence about the internment, exactly that silence was broken, gradually, from the 1960s onward, culminating in the official apology of 1988. But silence about a particular dimension of the internment experience. A silence about what it felt like, from the inside, to be a young person in Topaz, Utah, in the winter of 1942, watching a person across a mess hall and realizing, with the particular clarity that crisis sometimes brings, that you were in love. The censorship of the heart, what the mail told us. One of the most concrete and least discussed mechanisms of this suppression was the mail censorship system operated by the War Relocation Authority. Every piece of mail that entered or left a relocation center was subject to censorship. This was, on its surface, a security measure, the rationale being that internees might communicate with Japanese agents or otherwise compromise military security. The actual security risk posed by the internment camp mail, virtually all of which was written in English by American citizens, was essentially nil. But the censorship system persisted throughout the duration of the camps, and its effect was not simply to intercept potential security threats. Its effect was to create an archive of the interior lives of the internees. The censors read love letters, they read letters between separated spouses. They read letters between young people conducting courtships across different camps for, in some cases, families had been separated, assigned to different relocation centers, and maintained relationships across the distances between Arkansas and California, between Wyoming and Utah. The censors had access to a comprehensive and intimate record of what it felt like to be in love in these circumstances. And what happened to that record? Most of it was destroyed. The routine procedure of the WRA censorship office was to destroy mail that had been read and approved for forwarding. The physical documents were not retained. What was retained, in the National Archives, is the administrative record of the censorship program itself, the procedural documents, the reports, the statistics on the volume of mail processed. The actual letters, in their overwhelming majority, are gone. What survives are anomalies, letters intercepted as suspicious and therefore retained as evidence, letters found in the personal papers of individuals who donated their collections to archives, letters preserved by accident rather than design. These anomalies are what historians of the internment's emotional life, a small but growing group, including scholars like Valerie Matsumoto, whose 1993 book Farming the Home Place is one of the few scholarly works to take the interior life of the camps seriously, work with. They are, as all primary sources are, not a representative sample, they are the accidents of survival. But even these accidents tell us something extraordinary. They tell us that the love that formed inside the camps had a particular texture, shaped by the conditions of confinement, by uncertainty, by enforced proximity, and enforced separation, by the specific emotional pressure of living inside an injustice you could not fully name or fully resist. They tell us that people wrote letters about their feelings for each other in pencil on the backs of grocery bags, and that those letters were read by government officials before they reached the person they were meant for. That image, the love letter, the bureaucratic reader, the intimacy that passed through the hands of the state before it reached its intended recipient, is not merely poignant. It is an image that tells us something essential about the relationship between power and the interior life, about what it means for the state to have access to the most private dimensions of human experience, about the specific violation that occurs when love is made to pass through the machinery of surveillance before it can be received, what we carry forward, and what we leave behind. In 2018, the filmmaker Emiko Omori released a documentary called Rabbit in the Moon, which focused on the resistance and the moral complexity of the internment camps. In an interview around the time of its release, Omori, who was herself interned as a child at Poston, Arizona, was asked what she most wanted audiences to understand. Her answer was not about the constitutional violations, not about the political resistance, not about the legal battles. She said, "I want people to understand that we were people, that we had full lives, that we loved each other." This seems, on its surface, like a modest request. And it is modest. And the fact that it remains, more than 70 years after the internment ended, a request that still needs to be made, the fact that it still needs to be said that the 120,000 people who were incarcerated were people is itself the most damning possible indictment of what historical forgetting costs. Because what is at stake in this forgetting is not simply the emotional texture of a particular historical episode. What is at stake is our ability to think clearly about power, about categorization, and about what happens when states decide that certain groups of people can be collectively managed, collectively suspect, collectively reduced to a single identifying characteristic. The mechanisms of that reduction always work in the same way. First, the group is defined, constituted, through law and bureaucracy, as a category rather than as an aggregation of individuals. Then, the interiority of the members of that category is progressively denied their private lives, their emotional lives, their capacity for love and grief and humor and ordinary human complexity. All of these become invisible, become inconvenient, become threatening. The final stage of categorical management is always the suppression of full humanity, because full humanity is always evidence against the category. The internment camps were not an aberration in American history, they were an intensification of patterns that had deep roots in the history of Native American dispossession, in the history of slavery, in the history of every subsequent moment at which American power has decided that some group of people constitutes a category to be managed rather than a collection of individuals to be seen. And the love stories of Manzanar and Topaz and Heart Mountain are not simply touching addenda to this history, they are evidence. They are evidence of what was stolen, not just property, not just liberty, but the full, public, historically acknowledged right to be human in the most complete sense of that word. The right to have your love taken seriously by the record, the right to have your grief documented. The right to be remembered not as detainee number 13660 but as a person who wanted someone, who wrote to someone in pencil on the back of a grocery bag, who danced with someone in a recreation hall in the Utah desert, while the wind came off the dry lake bed and pressed itself against the tar paper walls. There is a specific kind of historical justice that consists not of reparations, not of formal apology, but of attention, of the willingness to look closely at what was actually happening inside these camps, not just the broad political outlines, not just the constitutional violations, but the texture of daily life. The emotional interior of people who were told, by the accumulated weight of their situation, that their interior lives did not matter. That letter in the Bancroft library, the one written in pencil on the torn grocery bag, the one found in the lining of a coat, the one that was never sent, remains anonymous. We do not know who wrote it. We do not know who they loved, or whether the love survived the camp, or whether they rebuilt their life after Topaz, or whether they married and had children who grew up knowing or not knowing where their parents had come from and what they had felt there. We know only the letter. We know only the words, I love you, in this place, where love seems almost impossible. And that sentence, those words, written by a person whose name we do not know, in a place that no longer stands, in a moment that the official record did not see fit to preserve, is, in its stubborn particularity, its refusal to be reduced to a statistic or a category or a political symbol, one of the most historically significant documents of the 20th century. Not because love conquered all, it did not. The camps were not redeemed by the love that occurred in them. The injustice was not softened by the fact that people managed to feel tenderness inside it. The damage was real and permanent, and some of it is not even fully visible yet, having passed through generations of families shaped by the silence and the shame and the displacement. But because that sentence, I love you, in this place, where love seems almost impossible, is evidence. Evidence that the project of dehumanization failed. Evidence that 120,000 people remained, despite everything the machinery of the state could bring to bear on them, irreducibly human. Evidence that the interior life cannot be interned. Evidence that love, in the end, does not require the permission of the historical record to exist. It only requires our willingness, finally, and without flinching, to look. Historians have a phrase for the gaps in the record, the absences that tell us as much as the presences. They call it the archive of silence. Every archive has it. Every repository of human knowledge is partly defined by what it chose not to keep, what it allowed to be destroyed, what it classified as too personal, too ordinary, too female, too emotional, too intimate, too internal, to be worth preserving. The archive of the Japanese American internment camps has an enormous archive of silence at its center. It is shaped exactly like the interior life of 120,000 people. It is shaped like love letters written in pencil on grocery bags. It is shaped like the conversations that happened at dusk between rows of tar paper barracks, when the work of surviving for another day was done and there was, briefly, a moment to be something more than a category. It is shaped like the songs that were sung, quietly, so as not to disturb the neighbors, through the thin walls. It is shaped like every moment of tenderness that the censors read and forwarded and then forgot. We cannot recover that archive. What was lost is lost. But we can, at minimum, acknowledge its shape name, the space it occupied, hold open the question of what we might have known if different choices had been made about what was worth preserving. We can insist, against the continuing pull of a historiography that tends to see political and emotional life as separate categories, that love inside the camps was not a footnote to the political story. It was the story. The political story was, in the end, a story about whether certain people would be allowed to be fully human, and the love stories are the evidence that they were. That no fence, no watchtower, no administrative procedure, no formal designation of suspicion could take that from them. That is the history they forgot to teach, not because it was unimportant, but because it was, in the deepest sense, undeniable proof that the whole project was wrong,